The gorilla was already there when Caleb Mercer opened his eyes, sitting less than 20 feet away with one massive hand pressed against the wet ground as if it were listening for something beneath the soil. Caleb tried to move, and the animal lifted its head at once. It did not charge. It did not bare its teeth. It simply shifted sideways and blocked the only clear path through the trees. That was when Caleb realized his left leg would not support him. His radio lay face down in the mud beyond a fallen cedar, close enough to see but too far to reach, and every time he dragged himself even a few inches toward it, the silverback changed position again. The forest around them felt strangely muted after the overnight rain, with water ticking from broad leaves and runoff whispering through a shallow ditch nearby. Caleb had worked wildlife patrols across the North Carolina Mountain Reserve for nearly 9 years, and he knew enough about great apes to avoid direct eye contact or sudden movement. What he did not understand was why this animal kept matching him step for step without coming any closer. Then the gorilla turned its head sharply toward a patch of ferns behind Caleb and released a low, breathy call that barely carried through the trees. Caleb froze. Nothing moved in the ferns. A few seconds later, the gorilla looked back at him and settled down again. It should have felt less threatening. Somehow, it did not. Caleb tested his fingers, then reached slowly toward the strap of his field pack. The silverback remained still until Caleb shifted his weight toward the right side of the slope. Its posture changed instantly. Shoulders rose. One arm extended. Not toward Caleb, but across the ground in front of him, creating a barrier without touching him. Caleb stopped. The gorilla relaxed. That was the first moment Caleb wondered if the animal was reacting to where he was going rather than to him. He glanced toward the slope. It looked ordinary at first: soaked leaves, exposed roots, a ribbon of dark soil leading toward the radio. Then a pebble rolled past his boot. Another followed. Caleb heard a soft cracking sound somewhere below the surface, too faint to place. He looked back at the silverback. The animal was no longer watching him. Its attention was fixed on the same strip of ground. Caleb's heartbeat quickened. His training told him injured people often misread danger when pain and adrenaline took over, and he refused to build a story around an animal he barely understood. He needed the radio. The nearest ranger station was several miles away, and his check-in window would not be missed for almost an hour. He pulled a work glove from his belt and tossed it toward the radio to see how the gorilla would react. The glove landed beside the fallen cedar. The silverback barely glanced at it. No display. No movement. Caleb slowly leaned forward again. The instant his knee crossed the narrow line of exposed roots, the gorilla rose. This time it moved fast enough to stop him cold, stepping between Caleb and the slope before planting both knuckles in the mud. Still no charge. Still no contact. Just a refusal to let him pass. Caleb stared at the ground beside its hands and noticed something he had missed before: fresh mud was seeping upward between the leaves as though the hillside itself were breathing. A low rumble rolled under him, not from the gorilla, but from beneath the earth. The animal backed away 3 steps. Caleb did not. For half a second, neither moved. Then the section of trail holding his radio dropped out of sight. For several seconds, the gorilla stayed where the trail had disappeared, looking down at the fresh break in the hillside before turning back toward Caleb. Rainwater had collected along the dark fur of its forearms, and every so often it rubbed one wrist slowly against the opposite palm, almost as if clearing away the grit. Caleb noticed the movement because it repeated whenever the forest went quiet. There was nothing dramatic about it. The animal would listen, rub its wrist, then glance toward the trees. That small rhythm began to feel strangely familiar, like watching someone settle into a habit without realizing they were being observed. Caleb remained on the ground, keeping his breathing steady while the gorilla moved to a patch of leaves a few yards away. It picked up a broken stem, rolled it between thick fingers, sniffed it once, and dropped it. A bright orange survey ribbon tied to a nearby sapling caught its attention next. The gorilla touched the loose end gently but did not pull. It only watched the strip flutter in the damp breeze. For a moment, Caleb almost forgot the pain in his leg. Then the gorilla stopped moving and stared past him again. Nothing was there. At least, nothing Caleb could see. The animal lowered itself beside a moss-covered log, resting one arm across its knee. Caleb had seen captive gorillas sit that way in training videos, but this felt different because there was no enclosure, no keeper, no barrier between them. The silverback picked at a patch of bark and uncovered a cluster of tiny ants. Instead of feeding, it brushed them aside and returned its attention to Caleb. Their eyes did not meet for long. Each time Caleb looked directly at it, the gorilla shifted its gaze away, then checked on him again a few seconds later. That restraint made Caleb more uneasy than aggression might have. It seemed to be measuring something he could not identify. A faint chirping came from higher in the trees, and the gorilla tilted its head. Caleb heard another sound beneath it, softer and lower, almost like a whimper carried through wet brush. The silverback rose halfway, listened, then sat back down. It did not call out. It did not leave. Instead, it pulled a handful of broad leaves toward itself and placed them in a loose pile near its feet. Caleb watched as it selected one, folded it with surprising care, and pressed it briefly against its mouth before dropping it. The gesture was ordinary, almost calming, but then Caleb noticed there were no bite marks on any of the leaves. The gorilla was not eating. Caleb adjusted his shoulder against the tree trunk, trying to ease the pressure in his back. The silverback immediately looked over. This time it stepped closer, stopping about 12 feet away. Caleb could hear its breathing now, slow and heavy but not strained. A thin scar crossed the animal's left shoulder, pale beneath the dark fur. Caleb wondered how old it was, how many storms it had sat through, how many people it had seen from a distance along the reserve boundary. The gorilla lowered its hand to the ground and tapped the soil once with its knuckles. Then again. Caleb felt nothing beneath him. The animal waited, listening. A third tap never came. Instead, it turned toward the west and remained perfectly still. The change was so subtle Caleb nearly missed it. Its body had gone from relaxed to alert without a sound. A few minutes passed. Caleb found himself watching the silverback more than the forest, noticing details he would normally record from a safe distance, the careful way it avoided slick roots, the quiet pause before crossing open ground, the way it checked the canopy whenever branches shifted overhead. There was a patience to it that made the silence feel shared rather than empty. Caleb caught himself wondering what would happen if the gorilla simply walked away. The thought bothered him more than he expected. Then the silverback reached down, picked up Caleb's mud-streaked glove from where it had landed earlier, and carried it 3 steps toward him. It did not bring it all the way. It placed the glove on a flat stone between them and backed off. Caleb stared at it, unsure whether the act meant anything at all. Before he could decide, a distant crack sounded from deeper in the forest. The gorilla spun toward it, gave a short, low call, and for the first time another voice answered from somewhere beyond the trees. The answering call came again, farther uphill this time, and the silverback reacted in a way Caleb had not seen before. Instead of moving toward the sound, it crossed in front of him and pulled a loose branch into the narrow space between Caleb and the slope. The branch was not heavy enough to stop anyone, but its placement was deliberate enough to make Caleb hesitate. A second call came from the trees. The gorilla touched the branch once, then moved away and listened. Caleb could not tell whether it was marking a boundary, responding to the other animal, or simply rearranging debris. Whatever the reason, it had changed the shape of the small clearing around him. Caleb checked his watch. His missed radio check was still more than 30 minutes away. He reached for his field pack and slowly removed a bright yellow rain cover, hoping the color might be visible from a search trail later. The silverback watched him unfold it, then moved to the opposite side of the clearing. That seemed encouraging until it began gathering dead fern stalks and pushing them aside from one specific patch of ground. It cleared roughly 3 feet of space, stopped, and sat beside it. Caleb stared at the bare soil. Nothing about it looked useful. Then he noticed the gorilla had chosen the highest, driest spot within several yards. The idea that it might be reacting to the terrain made sense for a moment, but the next behavior did not. A pair of smaller gorillas appeared briefly through the trees uphill. Caleb saw only dark shapes before they stopped. The silverback did not approach them. It gave 2 short vocalizations, turned its body sideways, and positioned itself so Caleb was partly hidden behind its shoulder. The smaller animals remained at a distance. After several seconds they moved off. Caleb felt a new kind of unease. If the silverback was protecting its group from him, why had it placed itself between him and the others instead of driving him away? He shifted his weight to test the question. The animal immediately looked toward his injured leg, then toward the empty trail below. Caleb stopped moving. The silverback relaxed again. Rain began tapping harder against the canopy. Water ran down the bark beside Caleb and soaked through one sleeve. He pulled the yellow cover over his chest for warmth. The gorilla watched the fabric rise and fall with his breathing, then walked to the flat stone where it had left his glove. This time it picked the glove up, carried it several feet uphill, and placed it beside the cleared patch of dry ground. Caleb almost laughed from confusion. The animal had now moved 2 unrelated objects toward the same place. He could not decide whether he was seeing intention or forcing a pattern onto ordinary curiosity. Then the silverback returned for a third object, a broken piece of Caleb's wooden trail marker that had fallen from his pack. It carried that uphill too. Caleb's stomach tightened. The pattern was becoming harder to dismiss. A distant engine note drifted through the trees, faint enough that Caleb wondered if he imagined it. The gorilla heard it. Its head snapped toward the sound. For the first time since Caleb woke, it moved quickly away from him, climbing the short rise toward the cleared patch. Caleb thought it was finally leaving. Instead, it stopped beside the glove and trail marker and began pulling broad leaves away from the ground with both hands, exposing a pale strip beneath the mud. Caleb leaned forward as far as his leg allowed. At first he thought it was rock. Then he recognized a straight edge. Something man-made was buried there. The silverback scraped once more, uncovered a faded orange surface, then turned back toward Caleb and released 3 sharp calls in the direction of the distant engine. Caleb knew that color. It belonged to an old emergency boundary post that should have been nearly a quarter-mile away. Before he could understand how it had ended up under the mud, the gorilla wrapped one hand around the exposed post and began dragging it upright. The orange boundary post rose only halfway before the gorilla released it, and that was enough for Caleb to recognize the reflective band near the top. The marker had once stood along a restricted service route used by maintenance crews, not wildlife patrols. If the washout had carried it this far, then the slope failure was larger than Caleb had realized. A few minutes later the distant engine became clearer. The silverback heard it too, but instead of retreating into the trees, it returned to the dry patch and sat beside the post, one hand resting near Caleb's glove. That was how Marcus Reed found them. The rescue truck stopped beyond the damaged trail, and Marcus stepped out with Dr. Natalie Brooks and 2 other staff members. They did not rush forward. From their angle, the scene looked complicated: an injured ranger, unstable ground, and a silverback lingering in the only practical approach corridor. Marcus raised one hand, signaling everyone to stay back while Natalie studied the animal through binoculars. Caleb tried to call out, but his voice carried poorly through the rain. He could see Marcus speaking into a radio, making the kind of decision Caleb himself would have made in the same position. The safest option was to redirect the gorilla away from the rescue area before anyone attempted to move him. It was reasonable. That was what made Caleb's stomach sink. A wildlife response team approached from the upper service road carrying visual barriers and food containers designed to encourage animals to move voluntarily. There were no threats, no shouting, no reckless gestures. They simply began creating a quiet corridor toward the western tree line. The silverback noticed immediately. It stood, looked toward the team, then back toward Caleb. For the first time, it stepped closer to him instead of farther away. Natalie lowered her binoculars. Even from a distance, she could see the animal was choosing proximity to Caleb over the open route being offered. Marcus changed the plan, widening the corridor. The gorilla still did not take it. It moved to the exposed boundary post, touched the orange surface, then returned to the same place beside Caleb. That small choice made the situation harder, not easier. The team could not safely bring a stretcher across unstable ground while the silverback remained there, and Caleb's condition meant they could not simply wait indefinitely. Marcus called for the reserve's animal management unit to prepare a temporary separation zone farther uphill. The goal was not punishment. They only needed the gorilla away from Caleb long enough to reach him. Caleb understood every word and hated how sensible it sounded. The silverback began making short trips of only a few yards, first toward the trees, then back to Caleb, as though testing how far it could move without abandoning the spot. Each time the team opened more space, it returned. Natalie noticed something else. The gorilla never crossed onto the freshly disturbed soil between Caleb and the lower trail. It stayed entirely on the higher side, even when the easiest route would have taken it across. She pointed this out to Marcus. He looked at the slope, then at the exposed post, but there was no time to investigate while Caleb remained injured. Another radio call came through. A portable holding enclosure had been prepared near the service road, and the management unit was ready to guide the silverback there using established non-contact procedures. Once inside, it could be monitored until Caleb was evacuated and the area declared safe. The plan was careful, temporary, and by every normal standard responsible. Caleb watched the gorilla pick up his glove one more time. It carried it toward him, stopped just outside arm's reach, and placed it on the ground. Then it sat between Caleb and the approaching team. Marcus waited several seconds before speaking into his radio. His voice was calm, but the decision was final. Begin the separation. The response team moved with the slow precision of people who knew that forcing the situation would make it worse. A portable screen was unfolded along the upper edge of the clearing, leaving the western route open and quiet. The silverback watched the change without displaying. It shifted once, then settled again beside Caleb, closer to the exposed boundary post than before. Natalie noticed that detail and asked Marcus to hold the team where they were. The gorilla was not guarding Caleb in the way they had first assumed. It seemed more interested in a narrow strip of ground running behind him. Marcus studied the area through his binoculars. "There is something under those leaves," he said. Natalie moved several yards to her left for a better angle. From there she could see a shallow line in the soil, almost like an old drainage cut hidden beneath years of growth. It ran from the damaged slope toward the dry patch the gorilla had cleared earlier. Caleb followed her gaze and remembered the pieces of debris the animal had moved uphill. The glove. The trail marker. The leaves. At first, each action had looked unrelated. Now they seemed connected to the same section of ground, although none of them could say how. Then the silverback stood and stepped onto a fallen log, raising itself just enough to look beyond the rescue team. It gave one low call. The answer came from deeper in the forest, but this time a second voice followed it, higher and shorter. Natalie turned toward the sound. There may be more than one animal nearby. Marcus nodded, but the silverback did not leave to join them. Instead, it climbed down from the log and walked to the edge of the cleared patch. It pressed its knuckles into the soil, paused, then moved 3 feet to the right and did the same thing again. Caleb felt a weak vibration through the ground, so faint he could not be sure whether it came from the slope or from the distant rescue truck. The team stopped moving. A few drops of muddy water appeared around the gorilla's hand, then disappeared between the leaves. Marcus radioed the maintenance office and asked for the old service maps. He did not know what he was looking for yet, only that the buried boundary post should never have been where the gorilla had uncovered it. While they waited, Natalie watched the animal trace the same short route twice more, never crossing one particular line in the soil. Each time it reached that invisible boundary, it turned back. That repeated choice made her abandon another assumption. The silverback was not simply reluctant to leave Caleb. It was avoiding something with remarkable consistency. The old map arrived on Marcus's tablet a few minutes later. Rain blurred the screen until he wiped it with his sleeve. The original service road had been rerouted 12 years earlier after drainage problems, and the abandoned section once contained a narrow culvert beneath the trail. According to the map, the culvert should have run somewhere below Caleb's position. Marcus looked at the washed-out slope, then at the dry patch, then at the gorilla. None of it fit neatly. If the culvert had collapsed, the ground should have been softer near the silverback, not firmer. If it was still intact, there was no reason for the animal to avoid crossing above it. Natalie asked the team to remain still while she examined the soil through a spotting scope. Near the gorilla's feet she saw several impressions filled with rainwater. Most were broad knuckle marks and partial footprints. One was different. It was narrow, rectangular, and too straight to be natural. Caleb squinted toward it, but the angle was wrong. Marcus stepped sideways until the reflection changed. The mark was not a footprint at all. Something thin was buried just below the mud. A strip of faded red material showed through the surface for less than an inch. The silverback lowered one finger toward it, stopped before touching it, and backed away. Marcus crouched several yards from the exposed red strip and stared at it until recognition replaced confusion. It was not ribbon. It was old utility warning tape, the kind buried above drainage structures before the service road had been abandoned. He pulled up the maintenance map again and enlarged the faded survey layer. The culvert had not run directly beneath Caleb as they first thought. It curved uphill, following almost the exact line the silverback had refused to cross. Natalie looked from the screen to the animal and then toward the collapsed trail below. The pattern finally began to make sense, but not in the way any of them had expected. Marcus asked one of the maintenance workers to check the ground from the opposite side using a probing pole, well away from Caleb and the gorilla. The first few feet were firm. Then the pole sank nearly 2 feet with almost no resistance. Beneath a thin layer of leaves and roots was empty space where stormwater had washed soil away around the old culvert. The surface looked solid because roots still held it together, but much of the earth underneath was gone. Caleb felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. Every place the gorilla had prevented him from crawling was part of that weakened strip. The dry patch it had cleared was not random either. It sat on a raised section of compacted ground beside the old roadbed, one of the few stable places left after the washout. The boundary post had been carried downslope by runoff and lodged near that same high point. Even the pieces the gorilla had moved there now seemed less mysterious. It had not been collecting Caleb's belongings for him. The animal had simply been shifting unfamiliar objects away from the unstable edge while repeatedly returning to the ground it trusted. Caleb remembered the glove, the broken marker, the leaves pushed aside, and the way the silverback tested the soil with its knuckles. What had looked almost deliberate in a human sense was something simpler and more believable. The gorilla had been reading the ground through pressure, sound, and experience long before any of them understood what was happening. Natalie lowered her voice. It knew where it did not want to step. Marcus looked toward Caleb. And every time you tried to go there, it moved between you and that section. No one called it rescue. No one needed to. The truth was quieter than that. The silverback had not suddenly decided to become a hero. From the first moment, it had been avoiding unstable terrain, keeping the other gorillas uphill with short contact calls, and maintaining its own safe position near Caleb because Caleb had ended up beside the same danger. When Caleb moved toward the weak ground, the animal reacted exactly as it had reacted for itself and its group. The strange behavior had never changed. Only the human's interpretation had. Marcus immediately canceled the separation plan. The rescue team shifted their approach to the higher side and laid lightweight ground panels across the stable route Natalie had identified. The silverback watched them work but did not interfere. When the first rescuer reached Caleb, the gorilla moved back several feet and sat beside the exposed post. Its shoulders lowered. The tension that had shaped the clearing for nearly an hour seemed to leave with one long breath. Caleb was secured onto the stretcher and lifted carefully toward the upper trail. As they passed the dry patch, he turned his head. The silverback was still there, one hand resting on the earth, listening. Beyond it, two smaller gorillas had appeared between the trees, waiting at the edge of the safe ground. The silverback looked toward them, then once toward Caleb. Caleb did not wave or speak. He simply placed his mud-covered glove against his chest and held it there until the trees came between them. At the upper trail, the rescue team paused long enough to check Caleb's circulation before moving him toward the truck. No one spoke about the gorilla at first. Marcus stood with his radio hanging loose at his side, staring back through the trees where the silverback had disappeared from view. A few minutes earlier, he had been ready to separate the animal from the clearing because every normal procedure had told him that was the responsible choice. Now he could not stop thinking about how close they had come to removing the one creature that had understood the ground better than any of them. Natalie quietly folded the unused barrier screen and placed it back in its case. Caleb noticed her hands were slower than usual. When she looked at him, she gave a small shake of her head, not in disbelief, but in the way people do when there is nothing useful to say yet. Caleb opened his hand and found the glove still pressed against his palm. Mud had dried into the seams. He had worn dozens of identical work gloves over the years, but this one no longer felt ordinary. He turned it over once, then tucked it inside his jacket instead of throwing it into the gear bin. As the stretcher was lifted into the truck, a low call drifted from the forest. Everyone stopped for less than a second. The sound was distant, almost lost beneath the engine. Natalie looked toward the trees. Marcus did too. Neither moved closer. Caleb closed his eyes and listened until the sound faded. At the clinic, the first thing he asked for was not water or his phone. He asked whether the gorillas had remained near the slope. Natalie checked the field update and told him the group had moved uphill after the rescue team cleared out. The silverback had been the last one seen leaving. Caleb nodded once. Then he turned his face toward the window and stayed quiet for so long that Natalie began reviewing his chart just to give him something other than conversation. After a while, Caleb said, "I kept thinking it was stopping me." Natalie rested the chart against her knee. "It was." Caleb looked at her. She added softly, "We just did not understand from what." That sentence stayed with him for the rest of the day. Marcus visited before sunset carrying Caleb's damaged field pack. One strap had torn, and a corner was stained with orange mud from the old boundary post. Marcus set it on the chair beside the bed and apologized for the separation order. Caleb did not answer immediately. He reached into his jacket, pulled out the glove, and placed it on top of the pack. "You made the call I would have made," he said. Marcus looked down at the glove. "That does not make it feel better." Caleb gave the smallest smile. "No. It does not." The next morning, Natalie brought in 3 still images taken from a remote trail camera positioned about half a mile above the washout. The first showed 2 younger gorillas moving through wet brush. The second showed the silverback following several minutes later. In the third image, it had stopped. Its body faced uphill, toward the others, but its head was turned back toward the lower forest where Caleb had been found. The picture was grainy and ordinary. Nothing dramatic happened in it. That was exactly why Caleb could not look away. He touched the edge of the print with one finger and asked Natalie for a copy. She left it beside his bed. By late afternoon, Caleb had propped the photograph against the plastic water pitcher where he could see it without reaching. Visitors came and went. Staff checked his leg. Marcus called twice about the damaged trail. Through all of it, the image remained in the same place. Near dusk, Caleb finally picked it up again. He studied the silverback's turned head, then looked at the mud-stained glove beside him. For the first time since the accident, his face tightened. He lowered his eyes, pressed his thumb across the worn fabric, and whispered only 4 words. "I am glad you stayed." Caleb returned to the reserve 3 weeks later with a brace under his uniform pants and strict instructions not to leave the marked trails. He moved slower than before, but the forest no longer felt like something he needed to conquer. At the equipment shed, he stopped beside a tray filled with fresh orange boundary markers and quietly picked one up. Marcus noticed but said nothing. Together they walked to the repaired service route, where new drainage channels had been cut into the hillside and the unstable section was closed behind a low wooden barrier. Near the edge of the work zone, Caleb found the old mud-stained glove still tucked inside his field pack. He left it there. That afternoon, Natalie showed him the latest camera footage from the upper ridge. The guerrilla group had changed its route. Instead of crossing near the washout, they were moving along a higher line through the trees, where the soil stayed firmer after rain. The silverback appeared in several clips, usually at the rear of the group, pausing near exposed roots before following the others. Caleb watched the footage twice. On the third viewing, he noticed something small. The silverback still tested the ground with one hand before stepping onto unfamiliar patches. It was the same movement Caleb had first mistaken for something mysterious. Now it looked almost ordinary. A week later, Caleb returned to limited patrol duty with Marcus beside him. They did not go looking for the gorillas. That had been Natalie's condition, and Caleb agreed without argument. Near a creek crossing, they found fresh knuckle impressions in soft mud and stopped several yards away. Caleb crouched carefully, studying the tracks without touching them. One print was larger than the rest. Marcus glanced toward the trees. Could be him. Caleb straightened. Could be. Then they kept walking. The choice surprised Marcus, who had expected Caleb to linger. Caleb did not explain it. Some part of him had changed during those weeks away. Seeing the animal again no longer felt like something he was owed. 2 days later, a trail camera captured the silverback near the repaired slope for the first time since the accident. It approached from uphill, stopped before the new wooden barrier, and examined the unfamiliar structure from several feet away. It did not touch it. After a short pause, it turned aside and led the younger gorillas along the higher route. Natalie saved the clip and sent it to Caleb with no message attached. He watched it during lunch at the ranger station, then set his phone face down beside his coffee. A few minutes later, he opened a drawer and took out the printed photograph from the clinic. He placed it behind the clear cover of his field notebook. By early fall, the repaired section had settled enough for maintenance crews to remove some temporary fencing, but Caleb asked that one part remain closed permanently. The old culvert beneath the trail had been filled and reinforced, yet the area still collected water after heavy storms. Marcus approved the request without debate. Beside the closure, they installed a small marker explaining that the route had been retired because of unstable terrain. There was no mention of Caleb, the rescue, or the gorilla. He preferred it that way. The place did not need a story attached to it to matter. On Caleb's first full patrol after being cleared for normal duty, mist hung low between the trees. He reached a bend overlooking the upper ridge and noticed movement across the ravine. Several gorillas crossed through the brush in single file. The silverback came last. It paused beside a fallen log and turned its head toward Caleb's side of the valley. The distance between them was too great for Caleb to know whether he had been noticed. He did not call out. He did not lift a hand. He simply stood beside the trail marker and watched until the silverback followed the others into the trees. Then Caleb touched the photograph inside his notebook, closed the cover, and continued down the trail. The weeks that followed settled into a quieter rhythm than Caleb expected. The repaired trail reopened in sections, the maintenance crews moved on, and the first hard rains of fall passed without another washout. Caleb kept working, but he no longer hurried through the parts of the reserve where the ground changed beneath the trees. He paused more often. He listened longer. Sometimes he found fresh gorilla tracks crossing a service road and simply marked the location in his notebook before continuing on. The photograph from the clinic stayed inside the clear cover, its corners beginning to curl from being handled. One afternoon, Natalie noticed it while they reviewed camera logs and smiled without saying anything. Caleb closed the notebook gently. That small silence was enough. The silverback continued appearing on remote cameras every few days, never on a predictable schedule. Sometimes it followed the younger gorillas along the ridge. Sometimes it stopped near a creek and remained there while the others moved ahead. There was nothing unusual in the footage now, which somehow made Caleb value it more. He no longer searched every frame for proof of what had happened. The animal did not need to repeat that day for it to matter. Then, near the end of October, one camera captured something Caleb had not seen before. The silverback approached the old washout from the upper side, paused near the permanent closure, and sat down beneath a maple tree turning red with the season. It stayed there for several minutes. The camera recorded no dramatic gesture, only the gorilla resting with its back against the trunk while leaves drifted onto the ground around it. Caleb watched the clip once and did not replay it. The next morning, he asked Marcus if they could inspect the closure during patrol. They reached the area just after sunrise. The air was cold enough for Caleb to see his breath, and the wooden barrier was damp with frost. Beyond it, the repaired hillside looked ordinary. Grass had begun growing over the reinforced soil, and fallen leaves covered most of the scars left by the storm. Caleb stood there longer than necessary. Marcus eventually walked ahead, giving him space without making a point of it. Caleb reached into his field pack and found the old glove. He had carried it for weeks without deciding what to do with it. The fabric was stiff now, stained beyond cleaning. He turned it over in his hands, remembering how the silverback had placed it on the stone between them. For a moment, Caleb considered leaving it near the trail. Then he smiled faintly and put it back in his pack. It belonged with him, not in the forest. A soft rustle came from across the ravine. Caleb looked up. Through the bare branches, he could make out several dark shapes moving along the opposite slope. The younger gorillas passed first, partially hidden by brush. The silverback appeared last, moving slowly behind them. It stopped near a fallen tree. Caleb remained still. The distance between them was wide, more than enough to make the moment uncertain. The silverback turned its head in Caleb's direction, held there briefly, then reached down and pressed one hand against the ground. Caleb felt something tighten in his chest, but this time there was no fear in it. He placed one hand over the pocket where the photograph rested. Neither moved closer. After a few seconds, the silverback followed the others into the trees. Caleb listened until the branches stopped shifting. Marcus called his name from farther down the trail. Caleb answered, coming, and took one last look across the ravine. Then he adjusted the strap of his pack and walked on, leaving the quiet hillside behind him. Thank you for watching until the end of the video.